Have you been blaming gluten for making you feel tired or bloated after eating? As a naturopath who has helped thousands of people with their food sensitivities, I found that gluten is not always the problem. People who think they're gluten sensitivity are often not. In this video, I'm going to show you what gluten really does to the body. And there's a test that I use with my clients that help you understand whether you really need to cut out gluten or not. So if you're ready to finally get some answers and stop guessing, keep watching. If you love eating bread, pizza, pasta, and who doesn't, but feel awful a few hours afterwards, then cutting back on gluten can give you some relief. But sometimes I'll have these same clients go on holidays to France. They eat all the gluten they like, yet they have no symptoms. So why is that? It can't really be the gluten. It's still in the bread in France too. So how do you find out if gluten is actually the problem? Well, let's look at some different ways that you can do to test for gluten. Let's start with talking about what gluten actually is. It's found in grains like wheat, rye, barley. And what gives these products the chewy taste, like when you're eating bread, helps give the strength to the product. But when it comes to our health, gluten has become a bit of a villain, especially in recent years. People are getting more and more symptoms, not just digestion symptoms, but things like brain fog, joint pain, skin problems. They can all be connected to gluten, and people can feel a lot better when they cut it out. So why is gluten suddenly becoming a problem for many people? So should you go gluten-free? Well, the answer is not so simple. This can depend on many factors. The type of flour being used, your genetics, your gut health, whether you have dysbiosis, whether you've had food poisoning, which has created SIBO, which is small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And while gluten can cause a wide range of problems, even if you feel better cutting it out, you don't know if you should cut it out all the time, a little bit. And it's important to know because if someone has celiac disease, they really have to cut it out 100%. And not everyone has severe symptoms when they have celiac disease. So one of the simplest ways to know if you should eat gluten or not eat gluten is just to cut it out. And if you feel a lot better, not just with digestion symptoms, but things like brain fog, joint pain, skin health, then you've got to work out whether you can have a little bit or not at all. And you need to cut it out for around 4 to 6 weeks ideally. Usually you'll get much less bloating and gas after the first week, but things like joint pain, skin problems, they can be slower to react. I had a client once who brought his son to see me, and his son had very high gliadin levels on his test results. So the whole family went gluten-free. And a month later when they came back to see me, the dad, who didn't think he had any gluten problems, found that all his joint pains had gone away. He just thought he was getting older, and that's why he had all these aches and pains. He was 56 years of age, not old at all. And a month later, he was moving and feeling many years younger. So does this person have to cut out gluten all the time? Well, we don't really know without more advanced testing. Most likely he should cut it out most of the time. So there's also genetic factors. Genes like the HLA-DQ2, HLA-DQ8 can make you more likely to be celiac and also gluten sensitive. But just because you have these genes, it doesn't mean you're going to be celiac. But your odds go from like 1 in 100 to 1 in 20. Even if you have these genes, you may not necessarily develop celiac disease straight away. Some people develop it later in life, and some people can be celiac and symptom-free. They call it silent celiac. I had a client once who, when she was 50 years old, she started to develop a lot of chronic health problems. Things like rheumatoid arthritis, colitis, terrible gut symptoms. So they tested for celiac disease and she was positive. So because of that, her daughter, who was only 30, also got tested for celiac disease. She was completely symptom-free. She was positive too. So it's likely that the mum had been celiac for a long time without realizing it. She had silent celiac disease. So the daughter now has cut out gluten because if she doesn't, her body is going to slowly damage itself to the point where she'll get a lot of severe illnesses later. So even people with silent celiac disease have to cut out gluten 100%. So I mentioned before that sometimes people go on holidays to places like France or Italy and they can eat all the pasta or bread they like. And that's because there's different wheat varieties there. And they have stricter laws. They're not allowed to put glyphosates and different chemicals in the foods. And so that can sometimes be the problem. It could be the additives, preservatives, and glyphosate on the wheat in the US, Australia, Canada. It's causing the problems and not actually the gluten. Plus the way they process and make their breads is different. They use a more traditional sourdough form in France, unlike the quick, let's make it as fast as we can variety in America, Australia. And so the gluten content is a lot higher because when you go through that sourdough process, it tends to have a lower gluten and it's easier to digest. As I mentioned before, sometimes people will do a wheat test and it shows that they're not reacting to gluten. And they're like, how can that be possible? When I eat gluten, I feel bloated, gassy, and uncomfortable. Well, it could be because gluten is actually a high FODMAP. And people start reacting to these FODMAP foods, which are fermentable carbohydrates, when they have small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. You should have trillions of bacteria in your large intestine, but very few in the small intestine. So when you get this SIBO, you start eating these foods, it feeds the bacteria produces gases, and that causes the distension and discomfort that people are experiencing. So it's not the gluten or the wheat that's causing the problem necessarily, but this bacterial overgrowth and the FODMAP part of the wheat. So how can we be certain? The answer is testing. And many people come to me and say, I have no problem with gluten. I had a test with my doctor, they said I'm fine. So when you go to your doctor, they're only looking for a couple of markers. They're looking for the transglutaminase 2 and gliadin, IgA or IgG. But there's a lot more to testing wheat and wheat reactions than these two markers. So if you become positive on the standard test, you definitely have celiac. But I wouldn't rule out celiac disease, especially if you don't have a lot of digestion symptoms just from that test. And now let's get to the best test for measuring whether you're wheat or gluten tolerant, whether you have leaky gut, and that's the Vibrant Wellness 𝗦𝗛𝗕𝗦𝗖𝗥𝗜𝗕 test. I've worked with hundreds of clients with this test, going through the results, helping them understand it, whether they need to cut out gluten or not. Let's have a look at one of the tests and I'll explain what it all means. And you can see the detail of this test compared to the standard LabCorp test or doctor's test that you might have had. So the first part of the test, it looks at whether you're reacting to wheat or also if you have intestinal permeability. If you have intestinal permeability, you're more likely to be reacting to not just wheat, but many different foods. So the first part of the test looks at transglutaminase 2, and these are the markers that they use in the traditional test to see if someone has celiac disease or not. And for this person, they're negative. It's also important to look at transglutaminase 3 though, which mainly affects the skin, and transglutaminase 6, which mainly affects the brain. Other markers for intestinal permeability and are things like zonulin, antiactin, and in particular the anti-LPS, which is lipopolysaccharides. If you're elevated for lipopolysaccharides, that means that you've got endotoxins produced by the gut bacteria getting into the bloodstream. That's probably one of the best markers if someone has intestinal permeability or not. So these first ones look at intestinal permeability and whether someone has celiac disease. Now we look at if someone is reacting to wheat itself, and there's different parts of the wheat, from the wheat germ, gliadin, glutenin, and other non-gluten wheat products. And the thing we want to look at is IgG elevated and IgA. If IgA, it's more of an immediate reaction. It's more likely to be an allergic response rather than a sensitivity. If it's just the IgG elevated, it's a sensitivity. These are the people that can probably have gluten sometimes, or even low gluten types of grains like spelt, or especially sourdough spelt from better quality wheat products. So the test is very detailed, and at the end of the test, it'll go through all the different markers on the test. And it's best to do this with a practitioner who can help you, guide you through and help you understand whether you should be gluten-free or not. So as you can see, doing the Vibrant Wellness test is super helpful because it takes out the guesswork. You know if you need to avoid gluten 100%, minimize it, have it sometimes, or whether you need to just heal the gut, and you can probably tolerate a lot more foods. There's also other reasons why people could be reacting to gluten and have other food sensitivities, or just have a lot of digestion issues. And that can be an imbalance between the good and the bad bacteria. So for a lot of people, it's really good to combine the 𝗦𝗛𝗓𝗏 with the gut-𝗟𝗏. And the gut-𝗟𝗏 will help understand whether you have pathogens, parasites, inflammation, not enough digestive enzymes, not enough good bacteria. And a lot of these things can be the underlying cause of why you're reacting to not just wheat but other foods, or why you have IBS. So the next step is to watch this video on the gut-𝗟𝗏 test, and I'll leave links in the description below to all the things we spoke about, like the DNA testing, the 𝗦𝗛𝗟𝗏, the gut-𝗟𝗏. If you have any comments, leave them below, and see you in the next video.